Welcome to the show brought to you by the National Association of Youth Organizations and the National Association of Non-Governmental Organizations, NANGO, together with the Zimbabwe Human Rights Forum platform, bringing you a show that looks at enabling an environment suitable for civic society organizations to be able to function well, and to be able to serve the interests of the people. Zimbabwe. Welcome to the show. Thank you very much for being here. Maybe you can quickly introduce yourself to the people that are watching so they know who you are and why we have brought you here.
Okay, thank you for having me. My name is Esnath and Macdonald. I am the regional coordinator with the National Association for Non-Governmental Organizations in the Western region.
So the Western region, which areas are we particularly looking at?
Western region covers Matabeleland North, Matabeleland South, and Bulawayo province. NANGO is disaggregated into 5 provinces, 5 regions. That's Midlands, that's Northern region, which covers all the Mashonaland provinces, that's Eastern region, which covers the Manicaland provinces, and then we have Masvingo, which covers Masvingo, of course. So I'm the regional coordinator for the Western region, which is Matabeleland North, Matabeleland South, and Bulawayo province.
Well, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
MacDonald, maybe you can introduce yourself.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is MacDonald, and I work with the National Association of Youth Organizations, NAYO, where I'm the government manager.
Oh, that was very quick and sweet. I like it. So maybe MacDonald, to start with you.
Yeah.
How important do you think is the strengthening of civic society organizations, particularly in a context like that of Zimbabwe?
Well, I think to start off with, civil society organizations are independent and autonomous development actors. It means that they have got specific roles that they play when it comes to enabling development. And in a country like Zimbabwe, we can all relate with the need for there to be efforts that complement whatever the government is doing in terms of delivering development in our country. And specifically when we talk about civil society strengthening, we are looking at efforts and initiatives that help civil society organizations to deliver the best that they can from the work that they do. We're talking about initiatives that help civil society to stand on a pedestal that it is recognized as a key development actor. And many times civil society in our context is referred to as regime change agents, as peddling a Western agenda. Yet, when we look at the actual work of civil society, it's working throughout the development cycle, ensuring that our citizens, Zimbabweans specifically, receive and gain access to social, political, economic goods that help them with their lives. And in many ways, civil society organizations have championed rights. They have ensured access to services. They have ensured that people also get to understand how government functions, and even the constitution itself, and how in a democratic society we can all coexist, especially bearing in mind the relations between the duty bearer and the rights holder.
That's really very interesting, because I understand that NAYO and NANGO have been holding CSO forums for the past months. So maybe Esnath, you can first start by telling us and giving us a look into what CSO forums are for those people that are watching that might not necessarily understand what it is. And then you can just go on to tell us, because we understand that you've developed a code of ethics and standards for local non-governmental organizations or civil society organizations. So maybe you can also just take us through the process of that.
Okay, well, I think I'll start with the question about the forums. I think one thing that has come out very clearly is that as much as we have a lot of CSOs who are acting as development actors, they don't have platforms to actually meet and discuss some of the issues that we're facing as a sector, is the shrinking of the operating space for civil society actors. And the shrinking is actually motivated by different factors, whether it's socioeconomic, whether it's political, whether it's legislation. But one of the things that's actually also adding on to the shrinking of the civic space sometimes is us as civil society not having the capacity to actually respond to some of the challenges. So what we thought of was that having platforms where CSOs can then talk about and address some of the challenges they're facing in relation to civil society. I think we're all aware of the Private Voluntary Organizations Amendment Bill, the Patriotic Act through the Criminal Law Code. So some of those things, we wanted to just have a platform to discuss what are some of the challenges that CSOs are facing, and then have a platform for them to discuss, and then sort of figure out what are the processes that we would need to do in order to address some of the challenges. And one of the key things that came out that we figure is one of the best ways to address the shrinking operating space is self-regulation. So there are going to be platforms, there have been platforms actually in the Bulawayo metropolitan province and in Harare as well, where we had meetings. We've had a series of about 3 meetings so far. The first meeting was just to have those discussions that I was talking about, to see that if we're going to develop a mechanism that, for example, helps us protect and defend civic space ourselves through the process of self-regulation, what are the elements that you'd want to be covered? So the first CSO forum covered that, and then it had sessions where we would ask, what are some of the elements? And some of the elements include, for example, labor practices, financial practices, monitoring and evaluation. So those are some of the things that the participants in those forums actually said, we need to have that in whatever sort of tool you come up with. And then after that, we had a follow-up sort of forum, a second one, where we brought back to the participants a draft of some of the inputs they gave us. Yeah. We came back with a draft, we went through it provision by provision and had their input, because I think also one of the things that keeps coming out is that whatever policies that come up that guide the sector for civil society must be participatory. It must have the input of the CSOs themselves, because for it to be implementable, it needs to be, I think there's a statement that a lot of the youth like to say, and children, they say nothing for us without us. So what we're trying to do is just make sure that as we go through this process of maybe going towards self-regulation, we want the input of the participants. And then recently we just did a forum as well, where we, after getting the input from the participants, we went back to them with a sort of almost semi-finished product to just see how does it land when we're talking about implementation. So those are the processes we've done so far, and there are of course more steps that are to come, but in terms of the CSO forum, so far we've done 3 in Bulawayo, and there are also similar forums that are also being done in Harare.
So MacDonald, I understand that the code of ethics or the code of standards, this self-regulation mechanism really brings about certain standards and principles that CSOs have to be able to meet if they had to operate in a Zimbabwean context. So maybe you can take us through some of the standards and some of those principles, and maybe also the reasoning behind the standards and the principles.
Right, so the code of ethics, like what Esnath was saying, was developed through a very consultative, well-curated process, which even involved a legal consultant at some point to help us to piece and put together the mechanism, which we now call the Code of Ethics and Standards. And within that, we're to reflect as civil society and say what could be the best principles or values that could inform such a mechanism that civil society was putting together. And you find that in the ambit of work of civil society, there is a lot of work that has been done to create standards that can best demonstrate the effectiveness of civil society in terms of the work that it delivers. And as part of that conversation and discussion, we then had an agreement to say, let's find an international framework that we can anchor ourselves on. And this brought us to the Istanbul Principles, which are 8 different principles that were agreed upon by civil society organizations, where civil society organizations were saying that for us to be able to do the work that we do, we shall be bound by these principles. We shall evidence our work based on these particular principles. And being 8 of them, some of them include issues to do with gender equality, where we're saying that in the work that we do, as civil society organizations, we must be champions of issues to do with gender equality and gender equity. Some of the principles also include transparency and accountability. In the work that we do as civil society, we must be able to demonstrate transparency and accountability. We handle money, we handle resources, we handle communities, we handle relations between different actors in development. Our ability to be accountable is going to be very critical. Some of the principles also include sustainable change, to say that whatever we are doing, we must be able to do it in such a way that we're also protecting the planet. We are here tomorrow. We also want others to be here even after us. Our work should demonstrate and show that. Beyond that, some of the other principles also include issues to do with human rights and democratic ownership and participation, to say that people in processes that they are involved by civil society, there must be an element of ownership. It must be driven by the needs and aspirations of those local people. So I find that the framework then provides a set of values that are going to inform this particular mechanism. And I think what's interesting is that as NAYO over the years, we've also come up with country reports around how civil society organizations have been implementing the Istanbul principles, and we hope that as we slowly move into the adoption of the code, it could also mean that we see an increased uptake of the IPs in terms of how civil society organizations are doing their work. Then I think I'm coming to the issue of standards. Maybe Esnath could just speak a bit and then I'll take it up. But in essence, one of the key elements of the code is that it is introducing a set of standards where we are saying that as civil society organizations, we are agreeing to be bound by these particular standards, that if we were to follow them and adhere to them, they could enhance the visibility of civil society. They could also even improve.
Prior to actually submit reports. I think when we also report to our donors, for example, we're supposed to submit reports, but if we make sure as a sector that we report not only to who gives us money, but we report to our beneficiaries, we report to the government, or for compliance reasons, just make sure we report. So one of the standards is ensuring that as a sector we ensure that we've got good reporting standards and we're meeting best practices when it comes to reporting. And we're talking about governance standards as an organization. Do you have a board in place? Do you have measures for oversight for whomever, for example, if you have a secretariat? So also one of the things that does, ensuring that you've got a good governance within an organization, is you have a defense mechanism. If someone comes at you and says, well, civil society, you are known for doing A, B, C, D, and then you're able to show that, no, actually we have processes that are governed by such structures, within our organizations. We're talking about financial reporting standards, whether it's having annual audits or however, often you have your audits, whether it's having your annual general meetings. So this is just some of the standards that we're encouraging through the code, so that if you have those in place, that in itself in the long run will ensure that the operating environment for civil society, on our own, it shows that on our own we are accountable. We are responsible. I think even as parents, they want responsible children, but as a sector, we want to be able to say we're a responsible sector. We can show it by the fact that we've got good accounting principles, we've got good reporting standards, we've got good governance structures, and we adhere to this code that has been adopted, by the sector as well. So those are some of the standards that are in there that we're hoping that overall they'll end up actually just contributing to just enhancing civic space and actually pushing the agenda towards self-regulation. Because if we can show that we do that on our own without anyone telling us we have to do it, but we know it has to be done, then it's easier to go towards that conversation of self-regulation.
So we have been talking a lot about self-regulation. I think for anyone watching, one of the words that we've thrown around a lot is self-regulation. So maybe MacDonald, you can take us through what it means to self-regulate, particularly as a civic society organization working in any context.
All right, thank you very much for that question. Before I jump into it, I would also maybe like to highlight some of the other standards that she left out. You'd find that the code also has got programmatic standards, where we're saying that in our programming as civil society organizations, if we could try to at least have these different elements, it can improve the programming that we do within our work. We also have got standards around human resource management, to say that as a sector we employ so many people, but when we are employing them, we should also ensure that we protect the rights of workers. We also even have standards around fundraising, to say that the way that we fundraise, it has to be sustainable. We cannot be going into communities today and then leaving the following day without giving them a plan of how the same intervention can remain in that particular community. And by coming up with these standards, the idea is that beyond just being accountable, we are also saying that as civil society organizations, we have matured in the work that we do. We understand how broad the sector is, but also more importantly, we understand the ability for us as a sector to be able to demonstrate how organized we can be, and also how pragmatic we can be in terms of the work that we do. And coming to the question around, self-regulation, you'd even find that this code of ethics and standards that we're talking about, it's voluntary in nature, meaning to say nobody is going to be forced to be part of it, but people that see value, people that see the essence behind such an initiative will voluntarily come and be part of the mechanism and utilize those standards that we have been giving reference to. Then coming to the question that you asked about self-regulation, basically it has to do in this instance with civil society organizations or non-state actors coming together and trying to set shared standards, shared practices that can guide a particular sector. And in this sector, it is civil society organizations, where we are coming to say that we have a responsibility in terms of delivering development. We exist in a context that is called Zimbabwe. So the self-regulation mechanism is then a pathway that civil society has taken, a pathway that civil society takes to sort of like own its own practices, to say that this is how we're going to conduct ourselves, this is how we're going to behave, this is how we're going to be undertaking our work. And in this context, also bearing in mind that we don't just work in a silo. We work with other actors, we must be accountable. We work with people, with communities. We must ensure that we include them in the work that we do. And this code of ethics is seen as providing a pathway towards self-regulation, because this is just the first and initial step towards something like that, which we would see in the few years to come for Zimbabwean civil society organizations.
So I also have to ask, doesn't this self-regulatory mechanism then in a context like Zimbabwe, and I would think in other contexts around Africa where governments aren't really keen on civic society, aren't really keen on respecting and defending human rights, doesn't this then leave a gap that state actors can then use in order to somehow start politically or interfering into the work of civic society organization? That then also defeats the whole purpose of being non-state actors, because you want to be independent of any government or political control.
I think in essence the mechanism works as a vanguard for civil society. And in coming up with the mechanism, we're not saying that we do not want to be regulated, we do not want to be controlled, because ultimately, like I said, we don't exist in a vacuum. For instance, if you look at some of the provisions on the standards to do with human resource management, they are very much in confines with what the law is saying. Because if you're going to employ people, it means you have to pay them. If you're going to employ people, it means that they must accrue certain and particular benefits on account of them being employed. And some of these things have to do with statutes within the law. And I think the compromise where this mechanism is coming in is where it tries to address some of the gaps that we have seen. For instance, if you look at the Patriotic Bill, if you look at the Private Voluntary Organizations Amendment Bill, and other pieces of legislation and administrative practices in that line of thinking, you'd find that some of them, they infringe on the freedoms of association, of assembly, of expression. And by coming up with this code, what we're also trying to do in the interest of civil society is to become more organized, is to interpret and still retain what some of these cardinal civic and political rights that we have as human beings and as non-state actors, so that we continue to exercise them, we continue to demonstrate and show the value that is in them. Because believe you me, at law, freedom of association is provided. It means you can come together, you can form a group, you can pursue your own social objectives. And as part of the mechanism, we are giving recognition to people that are standing up to exercise the freedoms of association. And in a way, it will then become a vanguard for them, where we can even stand before development partners, before government, and other actors in development to say that we are a sector. This is us. Speak to us on the basis of these standards, on the basis of these principles. And then you'd find that even the conversation becomes a bit more pragmatic, because then it's not just confrontational, but we are saying we've put this on the table. We stand to be guided by this, and we will deliver on the basis of this. And I think in a way that could even change the narrative around the conversation between civil society and other actors in development.
So Esnath, lastly, so now the Code of Ethics and Standards has been developed. What next?
Well, I think that's an important question, because I think one of the biggest things first is to have it publicized, raise awareness about it, have people know that there's this tool that's here that we can use to build towards this agenda, towards self-regulation and just enhancing civic space. So first and foremost, I think we need buy-in from the sector as a whole. I think there needs to be this understanding that the bigger picture in relation to this code of conduct is because it will end up helping enhancing civic space, but at the same time also just showing that we have the capacity to adapt and respond to the challenges we face as a sector. So first things first, I think it's just trying to raise visibility on this, raise awareness on it, sensitize the sector of the tool itself and its provisions, and then also in terms of what needs to be done to be able to implement it. So that's the first thing. And then I think after that, then pretty much if it's rolled out, piloting it in certain districts and seeing whether people are willing to adopt. But I think there are other steps that maybe Macdonald can just give further information.
I mean, pretty much I think you sum it to pilot the mechanism, to also begin a process of sensitization and awareness raising that could also even go beyond the 2 metropolitan provinces to the other 8 provinces within Zimbabwe, and to also begin to learn from the few civil society organizations that are going to be implementing that particular code, because our ability to learn, our ability to adapt, and our ability to strategize on the basis of those 2 is going to be very, 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 very important. And we hope that even through these dialogues, people, civil society, government, development partners, politicians, whoever, also begins to appreciate, I think, the process that civil society has been coming to a point like this. It means that we now need support. Beyond the buy-in of civil society, we have had, I think, through NANGO, conversations around self-regulation with government. Finally, something is coming on the table. They also need to, take a look into that, see also how they can create that enabling environment, even for this mechanism, which is housed under NANGO, to and ensure that the tremendous work, the thing about civil society, it has been resilient over the years, and we want to see it flourishing today and beyond in terms of doing some of the amazing work that is doing across the Zimbabwean communities.
I think that's a very beautiful sentiment to leave you guys by. Esnath, Macdonald, thank you very much for coming here and having having this conversation with us. I hope that for whoever was watching, they really at least get an understanding of the code of ethics and what it aims to do and why it was brought forth in the first place. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you
Thank you very much for having us.
To those watching, thank you very much for having been with us from the beginning of the show till now, where we're going to the end of the show. As always, remember to follow the conversation on #EnablingEnvironment and #Leaving No Youth Behind. This has been your host, Unika, Tatenda Kombora. Hisale kahle.
Shungu,